The Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 17.
Remain focused on the task. Don't get distracted. What is the problem, and prioritise.
Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson. Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm delighted to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, Owen Zupp. Welcome to the show, Owen. Are you ready to inspire today?
Absolutely, Marvin. Good morning. It's great to speak to you.
Great, let's go. Owen Zupp's passion for flight began in childhood, and he now possesses over 17,000 hours on a wide range of aircraft. Owen's career has included remote region charter flying and flight instruction, international ferry flights, flight testing, and the airlines. He holds a master's degree in aviation, and his writings on the subject have been widely published. Beyond the cockpit, Owen has authored 4 books and the popular website, The Pilot's Blog, at www.thepilotsblog.com. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, just a short introduction there, Owen. Can you take a minute, tell us a little bit about yourself personally, where you're from, and before we jump deeper into your extensive journey there, can you give us just a brief overview of what you're doing aviation-wise right now?
Sure, Marvin. Right at this moment, I'm converting on the Airbus A320 type aircraft, having been flying Boeings for over 20 years. So that's my immediate issue. Beyond that, my career dates back to as far as I can remember as a child. My father was a pilot. He inspired me, and I continued down that path to where I am today with 17,000 hours, and civilly trained by my father, and then through a series of general aviation jobs before entering the airlines.
Okay, and what about yourself? Whereabouts are you from?
I'm from Australia, and near Sydney. It's a small town called 𝗣𝗶𝗹𝗆, which some Englishmen may know as the home of Sir Donald Bradman.
Fantastic. Okay, good stuff. Today, Owen, you are our featured inspiring pilot. And on the Inspired Pilot Podcast, we do delve into the journey of our guests. So you mentioned that you are, in between, it sounds, a Boeing pilot to heart, moving on to the Airbus A320. Every journey does have to start somewhere. So tell us that story, Owen, of how you first got involved with flying and wanted to be a pilot.
I probably can't remember where it first started because it's as long as I can remember, but from my earliest memories, I was sitting in cardboard boxes, turning them into P-51 Mustangs, or I was swinging on clotheslines or jumping off garages like any inspired child who wanted to fly aeroplanes, I think. I was surrounded by aeroplanes. My father would often take me out to the airport where he was working, and I was left to my own devices to look at the aircraft and watch them come and go, and even sit in small simulators that were at the companies he worked for. So as long as I can remember, I was exposed to aviation. For as long as I can remember, I was inspired to do that as a career.
So you mentioned you were trained by your father. Take us back to that initial training when you were training for your PPL. For the benefit of someone sitting on the fence or thinking about learning to fly, or someone currently having their own training issues, what did you find challenging and how did you overcome this?
In a personal sense, I had the challenge of the family dynamic, obviously, with your father also being your flight instructor. But in a more general sense, I think the biggest challenge for me, which strikes most people, is the ability to finance the flying and to have another job as such to raise those funds and then to take that check effectively to the flying school in frequent enough periods to get the flying consolidated and back-to-back lessons. So I think in a civil training sense, that ability to fund the flying on a consistent basis was the greatest challenge.
Fantastic. Okay. And how did you overcome that? By getting another job? I believe you were in the medical profession.
Absolutely. My first job out of school was a business cadetship, which would entail tertiary education and also spending time with the company with a very major firm. Unfortunately, that didn't facilitate very much time away from the job. And my father at the time was flying the aerial ambulance, and I got speaking to some paramedics one day at the hangar, and their rostering was such that they did 4 days on and 4 days off. That allowed not only the financial aspect, but the time aspect to learn to fly as a secondary activity. And although I've said to people over the years, initially the motivation to join the ambulance service was that time and financial aspect, you don't stay in a job like that unless the motivation to help people and it is in the right place, really. You wouldn't last in that job if you got into it with some ulterior motive solely.
I think as well, in that situation, there is such a thing as a win-win situation, and obviously gaining the finances and sort of flexibility to progress your flight training and helping people. Come on, that's the best of both worlds, right?
Absolutely. And I think even in addition to that, I grew up very quickly in that I was 19 years of age and I appreciated flying like I may not have if I hadn't been in that job. I saw things in that profession, as you can understand it, and people's situations that made me truly appreciate my situation, so that every time the earth fell away from the wheels, I was very thankful.
Yeah, this appreciation of life, as it were. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we jump into your journey now, let's just touch on aircraft types. So you've mentioned two there, the Boeing 737, I'm assuming, and the A320. But how many different aircraft types have you flown to date in those 17,000 hours? And what aircraft do you hold the closest to your heart, and why?
Gee, that's a really difficult question. I think I'd have to...
I'm throwing it out there.
Yeah, you got me on the spot. I think in my logbook I'd have to check, but I'm up around 90 different types. That is facilitated by the fact that I also write flight reviews for magazines. So I'm very fortunate in that I get to fly types as varied as a Boeing Stearman to a Cessna Citation business jet these days. So I've got a lot of types that I have flown. Which do I hold closest to my heart? I owned a Tiger Moth for some time, and that ownership of that aircraft was wonderful. But I did fly a P-51 Mustang, a two-seat aircraft, and that was my father's favourite aeroplane. And there was something, he had passed away, and there was some link there that I think made that flight magical, in that I was not only flying this wonderful aircraft with wonderful history, but there was that personal connection. So holding it close to the heart, I'd say the flight I did in a Mustang.
Well, for a lot of reasons there. Which version of the Mustang was it?
It was actually an Australian built under licence, technically not a P-51 Mustang, but for all intents and purposes, it was a Mustang. It was built under licence in Australia.
A great meaningful moment there. So let's jump into your journey now. The first thing that sort of jumps out to me is your father taking care of your flight training, and I'm just having a little memory flashback to myself where my dad teaching me how to drive, and every time I missed the gear, I got a thump in the thigh. How was that situation for you? Let's start from the PPL up to, obviously where you are now. Let's start from the PPL. How was that dynamic like?
The dynamic was very professional. It was amazing how he was able to switch from father role to instructor role so quickly. He was highly experienced. He was a military instructor before he left the Air Force. And our garage, or our shed out the back, was set up with two large briefing boards and a series of models. So I would get a very thorough long brief during the week, a pre-flight brief prior to the flight. And then once we'd flown the sortie, we'd also have a 2 to 3 hour debrief during the subsequent week. So it was very thorough. In terms of managing the dynamic, he just created an air where I knew he was the flight instructor. I didn't ever look across and think, that's Dad, almost. The only time I did was when we were on a navigation exercise, or we paused beside the aircraft maybe to share a thermos of tea or a sandwich, and the walls would come down a little bit. But in terms of across the cockpit, it was a very much student-instructor relationship.
Fantastic. When you were obviously training for your PPL, what was your goal at that moment? Was it just achieve your PPL and then that was it? Or were you thinking the airlines and commercial flight after that?
It was a career goal. I probably wasn't focused on any particular aspect of aviation. I must admit his job in the aerial ambulance I thought was, and we have the flying doctor out here, was a fantastic job, very challenging single pole operations. And I hadn't ruled out, and still haven't ruled out, going down that road for a portion of my career. So I can't say that I was ever airline focused. I just wanted to fly and fly for a career. And my journey, I wasn't quite sure where it was going to lead me, but it ultimately did lead me to the airlines.
Okay, and what training-wise, what route did you take? So PPL, what was the next steps?
Yes, I did PPL, then I did CPL, then I did multi-engine, then I did multi-engine instrument rating. And then subsequent to that, not being able to find a job with those pure qualifications, I subsequently did a flight instructor rating.
So was your father the sole instructor throughout the whole of that period there, from PPL through to FI?
The only training I did that he wasn't the instructor was my very first 8 hours or 7.5 hours when I went solo. I did as part of a scholarship, and I had other instructors. That was when I was 16. And then subsequently my flight instructor rating, he wasn't an instructor on that course. But my PPL, CPL, multi-engine and instrument rating, he was the instructor for all of that in entirety.
Wow, that really is, it's sort of touching me as a father. That's really touching me because, you always want guide and inspire your children with the right tools and give them the right tools for life. And he's doing that and making you the best pilot that he can be, what he thinks he could be as well. So,
and I think he provided some of those tools almost in a clandestine manner while he was instructing me. He was also mentoring me as a father, and it became very special because I wasn't to know, but not long after I entered the aviation industry, he passed away. So all of those hours that I spent with him in the cockpit or briefing rooms, or as I said, sharing a sandwich under a wing, become especially significant in lifespan, so to speak.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm working my way through one of your books, the 50 Tales of Flight, and there's one, I won't ruin it, but there's one particular story, one particular tale which you sort of pay homage to your flight instructor, and I was hooked on that. And then the little twist at the end, it took my breath away, and it did make me sort of pause for thought. So do you recommend checking out the 50 Tales of Flight and to read that article? So we'll touch on that later anyway. So you've got your flight instructor now. What was that like in terms of you're now giving back to other students? And I'm assuming you were doing this just to 𝗟𝗴𝗰𝗆, I presume.
To a degree, as I said, I still hadn't really defined where I wanted my career to go. I wanted as broadly based aviation exposure as I could get, and I really enjoyed instructing. In fact, I've kept my instructor rating current now. I've had it, 28 years, I think I've had my instructor rating now, and I maintain that grade 1 rating still because I honestly enjoy training that much. And I can't say that it was pure hours building. I thought I would want to diversify and go somewhere else, but I think it's very critical in each stage of your career to be dedicated to that current undertaking. Don't take your eye off the ball looking too far ahead, because I think you must make the most of each stage, and I really did with instructing, and I enjoyed it thoroughly.
No, that's awesome. I like the thought processes there. Like at each day, just focus on that particular moment and that that particular activity, whether it's flight instructing or getting your IR, and don't look too far because everyone can sort of visualize. I can imagine IR students could visualize putting on those aviator glasses and turning left into the cockpit of an airline. But hey, you're not even there yet. You haven't got your particular license. Focus on the job at hand and move on from there. I do like that.
Absolutely. And you see chaps who will go to huge lengths to prepare for airline interviews, which you must do, obviously, but they're learning route structures of airlines, et cetera, and they're still working at another job and probably aren't paying that due attention. And it's almost counterproductive because your enthusiasm for your current job and your knowledge level of your current job will help you when you go for the interview for the next stage. And similarly, if someone rings up your current job and says, "What's he like?" your enthusiasm and your level of knowledge will be what that person is referring you by. So to look too far ahead, I think it's your loss, and I think ultimately it will be counterproductive.
Fantastic. Great bit of advice there, Owen. So you're a flight instructor. What was the next step in your journey, your career from that moment?
I received a phone call from another chap that I knew, and he was in a very remote region of Australia, a beautiful region, but very remote, and he was flying charter. And he said that they had a very small flying school and they needed a charter pilot, but they wanted someone with an instructor rating to help with the flying school. So I was in a car in about 3 days' time driving there, and it took about 3 or 4 days to drive there on the other side of Australia. So my next chapter of the journey as such was flying remote area scenic flights and charter flight.
Was that up in the Northern Territories, as it were?
It's even further west than the Northern Territory. It's the northwest corner of Australia called the Kimberley region, a beautiful part of the world and a very historic part of the world, but very remote in certain places.
Which of those 90 aircraft types were you flying up there?
In Kununurra, I flew Cessna 172, 182, 205, 206, 207, 210, 310, 337. And I looked up the other day, I didn't fly the Piper Chieftain up there. I flew that when I came back. So those Cessna types, I flew when I was there, 6 or 7 different types.
And what was the sort of biggest takeaway from that experience? So obviously you have been a commercial pilot, you were a flight instructor, but then now you're sort of getting out there, albeit doing the scenic routes and scenic tours. What were your biggest takeaways? As a pilot, what did you gain from that experience?
I gained a lot out of there. It was a very much an upturn in the curve of my career. We were all flying scenic flights to start with, and that was like how they blooded us, and then we moved on to the charter work. And I think it really instilled a sense of the pilot in command status. I am in charge of this operation. They give me the keys at the start of the day, and they expect me and the aircraft back at base safe that night. Whereas where I'd been flying in the city, there was a lot of support structures. There were maintenance facilities. It was also very difficult to move up the ladder onto other aircraft around the city bases because there were so many pilots. But in the remote regions, if you're trained, you're endorsed, you're licensed, they look at you and say, well, it's your job. Off you go. And this was in the days prior to GPS, so you would plot a latitude, longitude in the middle of nowhere and have to find it. And I think that remote flying chapter of my career built up a degree of self-sufficiency and resourcefulness and really instilled that piloting command sense. There was no one else. You looked around, you were in command and you were responsible.
I do. I absolutely love the sort of outback flying that some Australia pilots do go through, sort of like a rite of passage, as it were.
Yes.
Is that how you feel as well?
Absolutely. There are a lot of people who progress their career in Australia without going to these regions, but the camaraderie of being a dozen or so pilots all living in caravans and getting up at 4 a.m, then driving the bus to pick the passengers up from hotels. You learn all these skills and interpersonal skills. It's a wonderful chapter, and it is almost a rite of passage. But there are a lot of people who progress without doing that. The flying is very interesting and diverse, and I was also lucky enough to do a little bit of flying up in New Guinea, which is fairly mountainous terrain and remote in another way. So I did find those chapters of my flying career to be very enjoyable, very enjoyable.
The New Guinea flying sounds interesting. Where was that in your sort of timeline? So you're up in the 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝐵𝐵𝐺 now. What happens next?
I came back to the city. I was offered a job flying multi-engine freighters. And by the time I'd driven back, the job had disappeared, which general aviation can sometimes lead to those disappointments.
Thanks.
And so I'd left one job to go to a job that did disappear. And I subsequently on the same day just started walking around the airport with my license and resume and struck an instructed job / chief pilot position. And I ended up staying in that job from probably about another 3 to 4 years. But where it was very advantageous, the owner of the company, he was in the airlines, but he also realised that I had a diverse interest in aviation. He leased me out effectively to do other jobs. So that's when I did the ferry flying. I went up to New Guinea. I was leased out as a chief pilot to oversee new manuals for companies. I did a range of things in that job. My primary profession was chief flying instructor, chief pilot, and testing people for licenses, upgrading and renewals. But he allowed me and also hired me out as such to do all these other jobs. So it made potentially very regular job rather diverse with a lot of opportunity.
And how did he recognise this in you? Is this through conversations that you've had, or just, how did he recognise that attributes in you?
I think he recognised that I'd come back from the Kimberleys and I loved charter flying and I loved instructing, and he recognised that in me just through my enthusiasm. But he's also had a very astute business acumen, and I think he realised I had a diverse portfolio that he could use to the company's advantage. So I think he was both because he was a pilot, he understood my situation, but he was also a very good businessman, and I thought he was able to extend the tentacles of the company as such across a greater scope by using me.
Exactly. And you mentioned that word enthusiasm again, which obviously you instilled from your training. And it's another example of when you show the right enthusiasm, then people will recognize it. And that's one of the things that sticks in people's minds. So that's a great example there. Thanks, Owen.
That's fine. And I think it is key. I think it's key. You've got to maintain your enthusiasm through those periods when the industry does hit a trough or a low, because there will be a number of people who get frustrated and walk away, probably don't put 100% into their job sometimes. And if you can just maintain enthusiasm, it can sometimes separate you from the pack, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in this case. So what happened next? What happened next in the chapter of Owen's career?
As I said, I flight instructing, testing for licenses and renewals, doing these various activities, and a regional airline offered me a position on a ground school course on the Metro 2 airliner. And I undertook that course and then finished it, and then they said, we're retiring the Metro 2.
It's all about timing for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But these little hurdles build character, I'm told. And then
Absolutely.
I went back from there to freight flying and waited for them to call me for a ground school for the Metro 23, which they did. And then I was on the Metro 23 course, and it was quite literally the last day of the ground school. So I've never flown the Metro 2 or 23. Yeah. And on that last day, I got a call from Ansett Australia, which was a major domestic airline, offering me a position on a 737. And I think one of the takeaways from that was also I had applications in with airlines probably for around 2 to 3 years at that stage and hadn't had a single piece of interest. But I received that phone call, I think it was a Friday because it was the last day of the ground school, and within a week I had 3 other phone calls from other airlines, regional and domestic, so that I think there's something there that even though it might seem that the well has dried up, you just don't know what's around the corner.
There you go, timing again. I have heard that it's like the whole of the aviation industry sort of comes up in waves and in troughs, and it sort of goes. And so obviously, if you have applications out there, even when there's a period where the airlines aren't recruiting, then when you do, they do go into a trough or into a boom, as it were, and they need these pilots, then they are going to reach out to you. And if you haven't got, if you're not speculating, enthusiastically speculating, then you won't be there.
Very true. And keep that application updated, because if they do go through the files and they see that, this chap updated his hours and qualifications 2 years ago, even though you might have a few more hours, they will look at the chap who has touched base with them most recently, and they can see he's progressed his career, he's upgraded in instructor rating, or he's done his instrument training or something. So it's keep those applications in and keep them current to the degree that the company likes. Don't pester them, but keep them updated in keeping with the company's guidelines.
Definitely a fine line there, isn't there? Within who's this guy pestering us again for his monthly knock on the door?
And I think common sense will dictate that a lot of the time. You'll get the feel.
So I'm assuming then you took the opportunity on the 737.
I leapt through the telephone at them.
Absolutely. Did you maintain composure, like, okay, thank you very much, and then sort of screamed afterwards, or were you screaming down the phone anyway?
To be honest, my first sentiment after the rush of excitement was I felt terrible that I was going to have to go to this regional airline that I'd done 2 ground schools with on the Metro 2 and 23 and say, thanks, but I'm on my way.
No, thanks.
The saving grace was that I'd done both of those ground schools on the proviso that successful completion, I attained a job with them. So I effectively did that in my own time. They weren't paying me. I went and did the ground school at my own initiative. So I wasn't leaving them in the lurch as such. I wasn't leaving them stranded. They were quite enthusiastic for me. They had a course full of people there that had done the ground school. So my first thing was a little bit of embarrassment that I'd done these courses with them, and now I was heading off to another job. But they were very happy, and they appreciated that I was upfront with them and told them.
Okay, so what was the situation, the switch to the 737 then? Just sort of give us a sort of brief overview of that sort of transition onto the jet, basically.
I still remember flying down to the Melbourne, which is another capital city here in Australia, on an airliner. I think that was only the second time I'd been on a jet. I think the third time I was flying it. And
awesome.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe that here I was actually going there. The transition was subsequently you were indoctrinated into the company, measured for uniforms, shown around the facility over the first week or so. Then, in summary, I would say around 4 weeks of ground school, which was heavily classroom orientated, as opposed to now there is classroom and a lot of digital content. And then around 4 weeks in the simulator. So it's around 2.5 months from walking in the door the first time to getting in the aeroplane.
What was that like? So you've done the sim and now you're on the line. What was that?
Yeah, in between we used to do base training in those days, which was we went and actually flew some circuits in the 737 at a nearby airfield. And then the first line flight, I just remember hardly getting out of the seat on that first day, just trying to keep up with the pace of the operation as it seemed, and just not make any mistakes, try to do the best I could. And it was just exhilaration at the end of that day that I'd flown my first day on the line. But I do remember fatigue was a factor too. I slept very well.
You sound like a baby. Could you just enlighten us on when you said the pace of the operation there? What were you referring to there?
Well, in an airline environment, obviously it's procedural, very procedural in that you've got your checklist for parking, and then you have to pull out the performance data, work out your takeoff figures for the next sector, do the walk around, brief, get underway and go again. And this all takes place in depending on the airline, between probably 30 and 45 minutes. And as you know, with any new skill that you undertake, there's a level of knowledge that builds into your background, and you know where to put your hands, you know where to find the numbers. And all of that on the first day is still not a natural skill set. So it takes a little bit longer, and you're watching the time tick down, and you don't want to hold up these 170 or 180 people in the back. You want to keep moving and keeping pace with the training captain. As you gain experience, you soon realise that training captains, they're not worried in these early stages too much about the clock. They just want to get the foundations in correctly. But you do feel a little bit of pressure on yourself to try and do your best, I guess you could say, and keep up with the expected commercial speed of things. And it does come quite quickly because you are so procedurally drilled and the quality of training is that good. But that first day, you're really wanting to try to make a good impression, and you don't have all the figures in your head, like just setting up the frequencies for airways clearance, et cetera, After a while, you know those frequencies, so you can set them and move on to the next task, whereas you're still looking at the top of the chart for every frequency. What's the company frequency to set on the second radio? Which I don't know, whereas it's burned into your brain within about a week.
So you're a brand new, shiny first officer on a 737. What was next in line in your progression?
I was with that company for around 7.5 to 8 years and loved the job. A very good company to work for, but unfortunately it collapsed in 2001, not long after the 9/11 tragedies. I was subsequently unemployed. So it was a great job, but came to a rather sudden halt, to the degree that I turned up for work and just couldn't get in the automatic doors to the terminal. And
wow, so the
So
the 9/11 had a big ripple effect across the world, didn't it?
It did. The company was teetering at that stage, and we knew it. And I actually came home from a flight, and that night my wife woke me and pointed to the television showing the airliners flying to the Twin Towers. And at that point, I knew the company and the world wasn't going to be the same the next morning. And unfortunately, the knock-on effect in my small world was that the airline collapsed. Obviously, it was a far greater tragedy for the greater world, but in my situation, it led to the collapse of the airline.
So you got 7 to 8 years experience as a first officer, 737 jet time. So what does an unemployed 737 pilot do?
He drives straight from the major international airport where he's been given this news at 5 o'clock in the morning and waits on the doorstep of every flying school and charter operator at the small airport 10 miles away. I
didn't expect anything less from you, Owen.
Yeah, and so fortunately I kept my instructor rating and kept in contact and was still known around the smaller airport. So I had a job that started the next Monday teaching ground theory. There were no flying jobs going just at that moment, so I took a job teaching multi-engine and instrument rating theory, which was a very big step because it gave me a reason to get up each morning, put a tie on and stay within the aviation industry.
Yeah.
And that was a pivotal moment in many ways in terms of keeping the ball rolling. And once again, I think when I came up for an airline interview a couple of months later, I'd maintained the enthusiasm again. And that came through in the interview. If I'd sat there and they looked and I just looked at my shoes, despondent about where my career had taken me, I'm sure that would have come through in an interview.
Absolutely. I love that. That's a common thread throughout the whole interview here, enthusiasm.
Yes.
So what happened next then? So did you get that airline job?
I did. There was, as I said, about 2-month layover, but in the interim there was something also that I think had a very profound effect on my overall career. Was I was only getting 3 or 4 days a week ground school instruction employment, and the money wasn't terribly good, and I now had a mortgage and other commitments that come with the later life. So I went to the employment agency to see if there was a second job or if I was entitled to anything. I had no idea. And I took my resume in, and the words that still echo to this day are the employment agency chap saying, "Owen, you are highly experienced, you are highly skilled and totally unemployable." And
Great.
I still remember that. And I sat there going, I've dedicated my heart and soul to this career, and here I am. And at that point, I didn't know I was going to get the airline job. And just as a sideline, that led to my writing and also doing a master's degree and things further on, which I may well not have done if Ansett hadn't have collapsed. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself. But in the timing stakes, I got into the airline about 2 months later onto a contract job, but they wouldn't follow through because the airline that had collapsed wouldn't release me. And so they were still functioning and were talking about restarting. So I resigned, and the minute I did that, the airline who was looking at me as a contract pilot offered me a full-time position.
Excellent. So you still had ties to the old, they're still trying to have their claws in you, as it were.
Technically, yeah. And they did restart for a short period, but it didn't work out. So, yeah, I couldn't get the contract position because I was technically employed by the other firm. But at the moment I resigned, they let me interview for a permanent position. It was great.
And what kind of flying were you doing? And was that back onto the 737?
No, it was onto the 747 as a second officer. So with the seniority system, I had to start ground zero once again. And I started a second officer position, which is effectively a relief pilot in the cruise, climb and descent. And I did that for a number of years on the 747 doing international flying, including coming to the UK, which I absolutely loved. And
fantastic.
Waited for a slot to appear based on my seniority number to return to the 737, which I did. And having flown the 737-300 previously, this new position was on the 400 and the 800.
Yeah, with the newer technology. So you're a second officer on the 747. Did you ever have any ideas of, hey, maybe I could make it to the left seat of the 747, or was that just you had other ideas?
No, I think whichever company you work for in this industry, you aspire to the left-hand seat. Whether it was for the 747 or for a 737, I've always loved the domestic flying. I couldn't really say. I probably still just aspired towards the 737. Also, by that stage, I was a little older, and I didn't know if I still had enough career years to run in that one company to reach the left-hand seat of a 747. So I think more than a specific type, my goal was just to hold a command at some point.
Yeah, I have heard that the 747 is an aircraft for older pilots, so you'd have to almost be on retirement before you made it into the left-hand seat of that. So maybe a good choice there, Owen.
Yeah, there are some young captains. It just depends, once again, whether you hit that airline on one of its upswings or downswings. If you're a young chap who joins in a low period and then there's an upswing, progression may be 15 years. Now, if you join the airline at 20, you could be a 747 captain theoretically at 35. But if the company slows down recruitment, it can be many more years, to the degree that if you join too late, you won't have the ability to see that before retirement. So there are some young 747 captains out there whose career have just hit the right airline at the right time.
Yeah. Okay, so you're back on the 737, back as a captain, correct?
No, I was still a first officer because I had to join at the bottom of the seniority list again.
Could you just explain this seniority list for me?
Certainly. A lot of airlines base their promotional and aircraft endorsement changes based on your seniority number, which is based on your date of joining. It's independent of your experience levels. It's purely on date of joining. So you effectively join the queue, and when positions become available, you bid for them, and your success in your bid is based on who has been in the company the longest. So seniority system has operated pretty much in all the airlines I've ever worked for. There are airlines that have direct entry, that you could be a 737 captain here in Australia and apply for a company in the Middle East or in Asia and go straight in as a captain where they recognise your previous experience. But a lot of airlines, it's purely based on seniority or date of joining.
A great system to keep people within the airlines, I reckon.
Yeah, yes. And the what you do find also, and this is how I've gone for the Airbus, is that when times sometimes do peter out and it's a low swing in the airline industry, they do allow you to do secondments or take periods of leave without pay to fly for other airlines. And that could offer opportunities, but you can still return to your primary employer in the seniority chain once that 3 years or 5 years has expired.
Okay, so it's on a contractual basis. So, what was next then for Owen?
Enjoying the 737, but over those years on the 74 and 737, I went and did a master's degree in aviation because, as you can imagine, particularly with the international flying, there are layovers in ports and you have sometimes 2 to 3 days. And I would enjoy the city I was in, but I'd also dedicate 1 day to my studies. And that gave me a safety net as far as I could see in the aviation industry, that I developed a skill set beyond the cockpit. And that in turn led to some consulting on aviation and writing manuals for airlines and even being on an editorial team for a Defence Force manual. And that in turn led to writing articles. So over that period I was flying, I also began the branch off aviation career of the writing. And those two have now run in parallel since about 2006, I'd say, for about 9-10 years, yeah.
That's awesome. I like the way, you obviously had that shock when, a careers advisor tells you that you are unemployable.
Yes.
So you sort of touched on it there. So that's a good enough incentive to maybe I need a plan B or a parallel existence. Basically not have all your eggs in one basket, as it were.
That's very true. And the more I thought about it after that interview at the employment office, I thought it was very true, because in this industry, we're also very health dependent. I could be mowing the lawn and get a stone in the eye and be medicaled out of the industry. There were a number of factors outside of my control, another airline collapse that could see me back in this situation. So it wasn't purely a case of leaving a job or something that would lead to it. It could be something totally out of my control. I could be back here at square one. So that did motivate me to go and undertake these other areas of interest.
Fantastic. And in terms of, you mentioned as well that you are a Boeing pilot and converting to the A320. Is that a personal decision or one of your airline's decision?
No, it's a bit of both. It's one of those secondment situations I just referred to, where I was committed to take 3 years from the parent company and go to sister companies as such and fly the Airbus A320. So I've undertaken the endorsement on that and now undertaking the training in the aircraft. So that's another step in the career. You could say a little bit of a sidestep. And in 3 years, you then have the option of remaining with the Airbus-based company or returning to the mothership as such.
I love that. So, say, for example, in a couple of years' time, you've got your Airbus 320 rating. How does that affect your Boeing rating in terms of, do you have to keep that current?
No, you're only ever endorsed on one type at the time. So my Boeing credentials and experience, I guess you could say, effectively lapse. And if I was to go back to Boeing, I would have to undertake, once again, a ground school, simulator training and training in the aircraft to reinitiate that endorsement effectively. So it lapses in a regulatory sense. I think the fact that you have experience on type, though, does assist significantly in retraining. My wife's also a pilot, and she obviously went off flying for a little while she had children each time, and she had to recheck out on the aeroplane each time she came back after having kids.
Great. I can imagine the kind of conversations over the breakfast table with you guys talking shop and aircraft and airlines. Does she work for the same airline as you?
She does, although I'm on the secondment at the moment. But she's actually senior to me because of the seniority system. She joined that airline 2 years before, even though I was over at Ansett at the time. So she's senior to me on the seniority list. Yeah, she's currently on. They've retired her aircraft type, so she's on a few months leave without pay before reigniting her career, probably on an Airbus as well. So we're an aviation-orientated family, but I must say it doesn't enter the dinner table conversation very much. We're still sort of saying who's got soccer training tomorrow afternoon.
After the kids, excellent. And have you ever flown together? Is that permitted?
It's permitted. We've never been on the same aircraft type at the same time. And the other thing about it is we've flown light aircraft together. When we owned the 𝗘𝗶𝗴𝗰𝘆, we'd fly that together. I did some of her training, her multi-engine training many years ago. So there was a little bit of instructor-student relationship there. But we haven't flown together in an airline since, no.
Okay. So flying-wise, are we up to date now in terms of where you are at the moment?
Absolutely, yeah. I am now undertaking the conversion onto the Airbus A320 after 20-odd years of airline flying and 20-odd years of Boeing flying.
Excellent. And still trucking, as it were.
Absolutely. It's something new, something different, and once again, I'm enthusiastic about it.
Okay, so let's just branch off that. Let's hold that there for a second, and let's move on to that alternate career that you're currently progressing as well. So you got your master's degree. You said you started writing articles. How did you become a published author?
It was a transition from technical writing in the first sense to I wrote an article on my father, who I'd mentioned was a pilot, and he'd flown during the Korean War. And I was doing these consulting and technical writing jobs, and I saw this article published in a magazine, and it was great, and I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. So it was really that I so enjoyed the creative aspect of article writing to a degree compared to the manuals that I got into writing as a second job. And it was a very much a turning point in my life, because I think I'd possibly had that creative outlet waiting to be released for a good many years. But as you can appreciate, in aviation, it is very regimented, procedural and technical, as it has to be. But this now offered me a creative outlet that I hadn't had the opportunity previously. And then simply that progressed from these articles to maybe I can write a book. And that started when I met a former RAF pilot who'd flown at Dunkirk, Battle of Britain, night fighting, D-Day. And I sat down and I put his story together. And that was my first book, which was released in the UK, titled Down to Earth.
Down to Earth, yeah. I saw that on Amazon. How did you meet him?
He actually tracked me down. He'd read one of my magazine articles, and he had two authors previously try to record his story. The first one, he said, was a biographer, and I can't probably use the language, but he quoted that he did know an aileron from his so-and-so. Okay. So he had no aviation knowledge and kept slowing him down. And you've got to appreciate this chap was in his late 80s by this stage. And the second biographer, he said, would come back 2 weeks later and say, we finished at 9 a.m. on August 5th, 1942 last time. What happened at 10 a.m.? And he got frustrated with the process, whereas he and I would sit down with a recorder on and a cup of tea and talk aeroplanes.
Yeah.
And at times he'd tell me the same story 2 or 3 times. But my job as the writer was then to bring that story alive and collate that. And he didn't have to speak in order with me. I tracked down RAF records to verify the rate on DEP, what time he actually departed, and compared it to his logbook. So that was my job as the writer, I think, to put that together. So we ended up having a wonderful relationship, and I became very good friends with both he and his wife, both unfortunately who have passed now. But it was a wonderful experience. And once again, I stress to people, I had an airline collapse under me, but this probably never would have happened, this authorship and meeting these wonderful people, if that hadn't have happened. So you can't always assess where the road's going to take you just based on what happens at particular gates.
Absolutely. That's, just pivot. Things happen all the time. You never know what's going to be next. And like you say, this is a great alternate avenue, and something which many pilots, not just pilots, but if you're in one particular job and you have one employer, this is maybe something you need to think about as well. Well, everyone should think about. So nice one there. So tell us that. So Down to Earth, you've authored that book, obviously with the pilot in question. Where did the 50 Tales of Flight that I referred to in the beginning? I'm really enjoying that at the moment.
That's great. It grew out of, I had probably by that stage, I've written over 500 published articles now, and I guess probably by that stage I'd written 400. And I'd heard about this ebook phenomenon. I had no understanding whatsoever of it. And I looked at all the articles I'd written, and I thought, I'll see what is involved in this. And I picked 50 of my articles from a fairly diverse range, some reflective of what it means to be a pilot, reflective upon other pilots I know that I've lost over the years to aircraft accidents, and then some in the cockpit type stories. And I put them together and I sent them off digitally to the US. It's a wonderful world we live in, just as we're talking right now. And
Absolutely.
then the chap formatted it into an ebook, which I had no idea about still, and uploaded it to Amazon. And at that stage, we were going on holidays, and I went over to Honolulu, and by the time the aircraft had arrived, it had gone to #1 in aviation on Amazon.
Fantastic.
And it caught me off guard because I didn't think, I thought, gee, I haven't collated this in any particular chronological order, or I just wanted to put my thoughts on digital paper effectively. And it still is a very successful book in that I think I've had 5,000 copies now, and I have it in print as well. It's sold, and to the degree that I then, with a little more education, wrote 50 more tales of flight. And in some ways, I've probably attacked it better from a publishing sense than I had 50 tales of flight, because I just could not foresee that it'd be so popular. I just wanted to share my experiences with people, and they seemed to really enjoy it and run with it. So I wrote 50 more tales. And then, as you're probably aware, I did a charity flight around Australia a few years back, and I put that in a book called Solo Flight, and all of those have gone digital and then paper, and I've got more in the works now. So it's been a lot of fun, I can honestly say that. And the fact that I'm able to share the different things I've done in aircraft and the different people I've met and the different places I've been is a real motivator to keep on going and keep writing articles and to keep pursuing my career with the same fervour.
I think personally, I love your style. You touch on emotional topics, technical from experiences, other people's experiences, and it just becomes a really interesting read. If you're interested in flying a pilot or just even an airline or aircraft enthusiast, there's something there which you can, you really get at relaying information and experiences and emotion as well at times as well. So I really do recommend those books. Obviously, you've done the solo flight, which I think that could be a whole nother podcast. Let's jump into, so you're obviously done that, your blog, the pilot's blog. That's really successful and just as well written resource there. I do like the way that you have the sort of three main sections: the practical pilot, the pilot news, and you even cater for passengers or people that fly on aircraft. I do love that you sort of touch on a lot of bases there, or some real key bases. Tell us about the blog. How did that come about?
It evolved because I had a website, owenzupp.com, which I still have, to support the books, and I was doing speaking engagements and various activities. But I found apparently in this internet world, discoverability is premium, and people were searching more for aviation than they were for Owen Zupp. It's not a common search term by all accounts.
No.
And then and so I started an aviation-centric blog effectively, and it 7 or 8 months ago, and it just took off. And I've actually found that with the books and the blog, people do now search for Owen Zupp, and they find the blog often via that Owen Zupp website. But it once again was a medium that I could share aviation with people, and the feedback I get from all corners of the earth, I'm sure you can feel the same thing with your podcast, that you get emails from places you'd never imagine, and students undertaking pilot training, and the questions you get asked often provide me with material for the blog or for another book, because they're aspects of aviation that aren't mine, but they're real considerations. So that's how I came to write it, and it actually launched around the time that we had the MH17 tragedy, and I had about 80,000 people visit that day from Malaysia, which was those sort of...
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it sort of knocked my socks off that aviation was that far-reaching. I understood it in a more general sense. And the emails I received from Malaysia and from people who were asking questions, which I could only answer on a limited basis, because one of my real bugbears at times are those sensational immediate reports you have in any aviation event just to fill the headlines. But
yeah, all these experts, etc.
Absolutely, and anyone who's flown for any period of time is very wary of that title, because the minute you think you know it all, you're in a very rarefied atmosphere there. You're just waiting to tempt the gods for something to go wrong. You're learning to the day you park the brakes for the last time. Absolutely. And it really rammed home to me through a terrible tragedy just how far-reaching aviation was beyond the aviation community. And I think that was one of the reasons that the passengers, pilot, etc. was born, because a lot of the questions are, I'm waiting to depart and I hear a thump under the floor, or they're talking about a rapid depressurization. What's that? What's an RNP approach? And things like that, which we in the aviation industry, even if we only have a moderate understanding, we have the fundamental concept, but there's people there who fly in aeroplanes frequently, who are putting their total trust in us as pilots. But often knowledge can dispel some of that fear, and that's where this broader base of aviation topics probably stemmed from.
The passengers pilot, I can see another book opportunity there.
Yeah, join the queue. It's
I can imagine.
I've got about 3 projects underway, which you can understand during training have sort of, I won't say gone onto the back burner, but they've accelerated. It's an interesting journey in so many ways, but I don't think I can imagine an aviation career now that I don't write it. It's cathartic in an industry where we're tied up with numbers and statistics and facts and figures. It gives me the opportunity to tell you the colours of the sunrise rather than it happening at 6:17 a.m.
Yeah, excellent. You can actually express yourself, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great. And I can give those books to my children, which they do read. One of them's halfway through Solo Flight, and one of them's read 50 Tales now. And they have an insight into what I've done for a job and what my life's been about, or a very big chapter of my life. And they even get a mention here and there. So it serves so many purposes beyond the cockpit that are very, very satisfying.
I think you're almost passing down what your father passed to you in terms of, I guess, integrity and maybe some of the knowledge even. Have you actually passed on any sort of tips and hints and tips to your son?
He's only a young fella, but I must admit I've passed a lot of what my father instilled in me onto student pilots over the years. My father was very methodical, very much for keeping it simple, get back to the basics, sort the problem out, don't rush in. And his sense of airmanship, etc., were as vital to my career as the manipulative skills he instilled. So I'm sure that if my son or my daughters want to go down that road, I am the byproduct of all the pilots I've flown with, but particularly my father, just as I'm sure he was the byproduct of a number of military instructors and combat missions and international flying and rainmaking in aeroplanes. Everything that he did developed him into the pilot entity he was. It's happening to me, and hopefully out there I've instilled a little bit in people just as my father instilled in me. So it's a wonderful relationship, the instructor-student relationship, I find.
I love that. I am the byproduct of all the instructors I've flown with. That's awesome. Yeah,
and it's very true. It's in life, we're the byproduct of the relationships we have around us, and flying is no different. And you still hear those voices of your instructors at times, no matter where your career goes. Watch your airspeed or do this. It's burnt into there. So you truly are.
I love that, Owen. Okay, tell me, what are you excited about right now?
Oh, I'd say I'm excited about and wishing for the completion of the A320 conversion, get online and fly this new aircraft type after so many years on a Boeing. I'm excited about that. And I'm also excited about some of the book projects I've got underway, because once again, that is such an outlet for me away from work. Just the pure essence of writing for the pilot's blog or writing a book just keeps my life in balance. It's exciting just to take my kids for a ride on a bike every day. So I'm very, very fortunate. I've got a wife who understands the industry implicitly, who supports me, and I've got these new aircraft types on the horizon. I've got more riding to go. So I'm as keen as I was the day I started, Marvin, to be perfectly honest.
I can feel that in your voice as well. I love that. And just as grounded to be excited about taking your kids on a bike ride. Love it.
Yeah, no, it is. As a father, you can appreciate it. It's just as it's so critical. We love our aviation, but we've got to keep it in perspective.
Well, I'm halfway through the 50 Tales of Flight, and I'm going to ask you the impossible question. What is your proudest moment in your flying career so far?
The proudest moment, I knew you had a killer question at the end, and as we started talking, I couldn't recall what it was. Yeah, the proudest moment, first solo, that feeling of being alone in the aeroplane, and I remember being downwind, looking at that runway to my left and looking to that seat to my right and seeing no one and thinking, I am flying. After these years of sitting in cardboard boxes and swinging on clotheslines and jumping off garage roofs, hanging around airports and looking at the cracks in hangar doors, I was flying the aeroplane. And I don't think I will ever lose that moment.
Beautiful. I think a lot of pilots can appreciate what you said there.
Yeah, I'm sure.
You touched on a few things there as well in terms of your future plans. So, but what are your future plans? What's next? Obviously, there's lots of writing going on, but and the A320. But what's next?
I'd say to thoroughly enjoy my time on the A320 over the remaining period of this 3 years, and then make the decision where I go from there. Whether I go back to the mother airline or if I stay on the A320, and that will once again depend a little bit on seniority, I suspect, as to what aircraft type my seniority will allow me to go back on. So it's really just to continue to develop the career, and I think also critical at that point is to always remember that whatever you're flying, be it a 152 or an A320 or a 737, is just to apply yourself with the same level of dedication as you did the first day on type, because the big dangers as experience grows can be familiarity and complacency, and you must keep those two at bay. Standard operating procedures are a very good weapon, but you've got to guard against that. As experience gives you a protection against certain threats, complacency and familiarity can creep in very insidiously. And I think if I was to look at the remaining years of my career, the goal is to remain as enthusiastic and as procedural and as wary as I was the first day that I came into the industry. Take nothing for granted, keep your ears open and keep learning.
Fantastic, Owen. I do love that. And just as you mentioned that, I just had to recall a memory of reading one of your stories from the 50 Tales of Flight. It was basically what you mentioned about flying single-engine aircraft, and sometimes it's easy to draw that sort of magenta line straight over the mountains, but having, at the expense of time, saving time, if there's an opportunity to go around, obviously with suitable landing areas, take that. And that is one of the things that when I read that, I went, I've just took that on board. Obviously, everyone knows that's the idea, but how you conveyed it really sort of drove it home, and that's actually sunk in my head. And I'm actually on air giving you that feedback and saying thank you to you. So thank you for that.
That's great, Marvin. And as I said, that's what I do it for. I never tire of the emails and the feedback and the questions I get from people, because I was there, and I fortunately had my father who I could walk out to the garage and say to him, Dad, I've got a question. But not everyone has someone 24/7 they can ask questions, and I can't always give the answer, but I can hopefully steer someone in the right direction.
Fantastic. Okay, Owen, this is my favorite part of the show. This is the quick fire checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound? You ready?
I'm ready to go.
Okay, let's go. What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
The best piece of advice would be remain focused on the task. Don't get distracted. What is the problem, and prioritize.
Fantastic. Do you have a favorite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
To be honest, any aviation podcast, including The Inspired Pilot, I love the podcast, and I think that's the way that many resources are going. So The Inspired Pilot, how's that?
Fantastic. I need to get a sound effect. I might actually put it in there in post-production. Okay. Can you share one of your personal habits that you find useful and believe contributes to your flying success?
Getting up early and getting any tasks out of the way early in the day when the brain is fresh and the house is quiet.
Great piece of advice there. Something I follow as well. Trikes or tail draggers?
Tail draggers.
Good boy. Can you recommend one aviation-related book?
To Fly and Fight by Bud Anderson. It's not overly advertised, but I found it a very interesting tale.
Okay, I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes. Okay, what is your favourite non-essential but essential to you technology gadget in your cockpit?
We're using iPads now, and whilst we have the paper resource to back that up, the iPad for the use of performance calculations, etc., I find a very, very useful aid.
Okay, the iPad sounds good. Is that an official item?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It has to be all certified and ratified before it can be used on the flight deck. And I've seen a transition where we've gone from paper to iPad, and it's a wonderful tool.
Okay, this is my favourite question, and I'm really curious about what your answer is based on your experience. If you had a time machine and could go back in time and meet your younger self just as you're about to start your flying journey, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself, Owen?
I would forewarn myself very firmly that the aviation has peaks and troughs, and get that second career or that second job. Just started off on the side. I would have started writing earlier. But to have something to fall back on, be it a tertiary qualification or a second skill set, I think rather than waiting till the collapse of an airline, I would have been better prepared having a second skill set, whatever it may be, earlier on in my career.
Great piece of advice there. Owen, thank you very much. Your stories have been absolutely inspiring to me. I was really curious, obviously, after reading your 50 Tales of Flight to hear what some of your answers are going to be. So I know the listeners are going to find that very inspiring too. Can you give the audience of Inspired Pilots one last piece of guidance and then share how people can get in contact with you, and then we'll sign off?
I think you've drawn the piece of guidance through this interview in that I think you maintain your enthusiasm and your self-discipline, and remain focused on the industry as such, despite whether there's ups and downs. Be persistent. Don't walk away when the industry is in a lull. So enthusiasm, persistence, those characteristics are imperative to pursuing and maintaining a career. In terms of getting in touch with me, I think the best way is through the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 Twitter and Facebook, and on the pilotsblog.com too. Of that 50 Tales of Flight, there's 5 Tales of Flight you can download there if you want to have a read for free.
Excellent.
But through the pilotsblog.com, Facebook or Twitter, feel free to touch base, and I look forward to hearing from your listeners.
Excellent. I'll make sure all those links and how people can get in contact with you will be on your show notes.
Thanks, Marvin.
Owen, thank you very much for joining us on the show today, for your time. I know it's very, very early there. You've been very generous. On behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you and speak to you again.
Marvin, it's been my absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed speaking with you, and I look forward to hearing from some of your listeners, because that's what keeps me going.
Excellent. I'm sure they will do. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you so much for joining me today for episode 17 of the Inspired Pilot podcast. I really enjoyed the interview with Owen, and as we heard, as well as being an extremely experienced pilot across a large number of aircraft types and a talented writer, he's also a genuine, down-to-earth, really nice guy, which is a bonus, right? The common theme of enthusiasm that was highlighted throughout Owen's journey is a fantastic takeaway, and I really do love those takeaways that are so good that they even transcend aviation and can be used in other areas of our lives. I'm a fan of Owen's writing, and I do recommend that you check out the books that Owen has published so far, as well as the 50 Tales of Flight that I was referring to in the interview. He has since published another book, The Practical Pilot, Volume 1, The Pilot's Common Sense Guide to Safer Flying. I bought this book myself, and I see it as a great sort of companion type book for the existing pilot, and an absolute no-brainer if you're just starting out or learning, or currently thinking about learning to fly. A great learning resource. You can find links to all of Owen's books on his show notes page. Don't forget to head over to the show's website, inspiredpilot.com. That's where you'll find the show notes for every episode. You can also leave a comment for Owen there, just below the show notes, and for the other guests on their pages. You can also find the links to all the resources and everything else mentioned by Owen, and much, much more. I really appreciate and love receiving feedback about the show, so do get in touch. I reply to every single email, and I'm active on Facebook and Twitter, so say hello. If you do like the show, I'll be really, really, really grateful if you share it with your friends, colleagues, and fellow Av geeks. And if you do feel inclined, please leave a rating and a review on iTunes, as this does help, increase the show's exposure and therefore getting the journeys of our featured inspiring pilots in front of and inspiring more people, which is why I'm here, it's why the show's here, and the whole mission of the podcast. And don't forget, wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.